This week they announced that unemployment in the United States was in the 25% range. The last time it's been this high was during the Depression. During the Depression, there was a response to all this unemployment. It was called the Unemployed Workers movement. And as we look at our current society today and the suffering that's going to happen as this unemployment drags out, it's important to see what's going to, how unemployed workers can support themselves and how they can advocate for themselves. And the unemployed workers movement, the history of it, should be a very interesting story. Now, in order to understand the unemployed workers movement, let's study the Depression. Now, the Depression started in 1929 with a stock market collapse in October, and this led to rolling layoffs in various industries. The public thought it was temporary, just like we think about the coronavirus layoffs. However, the Depression actually lasted 10 years, and its full effects were not gone until World War II. Unemployment was 8 to 10% before the crash. Now, that's a little higher than we would expect, and that was due to the mechanization. The factories were producing Model Ts and other farm implements that drove people off the farms. And frankly, these factories weren't producing as many jobs as they were producing cars, for example. And so the unemployment rate in 1932, as a result of all these layoffs, was 24.9%, very similar to what it is today. Now, there was also another phenomenon that I'll call underemployment. And this was basically people who didn't have jobs that paid enough. They sold apples and pencils. They took other odd jobs. They weren't considered unemployed. They were certainly underemployed. And then, of course, there were other phenomena like men traveling the rails looking for work. I read that in one year they kicked 600,000 people off the rails as they were just riding the trains to and from different cities looking for work. On top of all this misery, in 1930 there was a severe drought in the Midwest called the Dust Bowl, and millions of farmers ended up living on Red Cross states in dry Midwestern states like Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. And many of those people eventually fled those states and moved to California and other places. Then, as the unemployment went on, many people became homeless. And these homeless people set up shanty towns, Hoovervilles, they called them at the time after President Hoover, in various cities. And these Hoovervilles were fairly large. And then in 1932, World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus in 1945 but were unemployed went to Washington, D.C. and protested. And while they were there, they set up a shanty town, a Hooverville. And the U.S. Army, after some conflict with the police department, was sent in by President Hoover. And President Hoover's soldiers burned out these Hoovervilles. They literally lit them on fire, even though people had families in there. The amount of suffering in the working classes during the Depression was immeasurable. And as I consider the coronavirus and the employment we're facing today, I'm very concerned about how this is going to go. During the Depression, there was very little public support for the unemployed. There was the Red Cross, often giving food and some aid. There were some cities that had social workers giving out some aid. But as a whole, there were cultural reasons why the unemployed in our country were not given direct support. The dole was an anathema to the American spirit of work and self-sufficiency. Therefore, it should be dispensed to as few as possible and made as harsh as possible to discourage reliance upon it. This was in a book written by Piven and Showard. It was called Poor People's Movements, describing the culture of the day. And there was fear that there was any dole, any money given directly to workers, they would choose that over the hard work of the day, physical labor that many people had to do to survive. It was also terrible humiliation for those who were applied for aid. And matter of fact, in 14 states, paupers, as they called people who didn't have successful jobs, could not even vote. They were denied the right to vote as citizens have. What made this doubly difficult is that the poor believed those values too. They came to this country to work. And then they didn't demand relief because it would show they were unable to work. So there were tremendous cultural barriers to receiving work or receiving money and surviving. Now, the Hoover administration had a bill that was given to them to try to make direct payments to workers because of the huge numbers of people who were out of work. And the Hoover administration rejected those federal aid payments. President Hoover wanted it to be up to the local charities, even the local cities, to help people. However, it was obvious that the local charities were overwhelmed. Now, while the government was rejecting the unemployed, and while the nonprofits were not able to really support the unemployed, the communists cared about the unemployed people. And matter of fact, on March 6th of 1930, they set up something called International Unemployment Day. This started out as a celebration of the 1917 revolt in Russia. However, because they called it International Unemployment Day, there was 100,000 workers showed up in New York and a similar number in Detroit, Chicago, and other cities. This was considered a big success. And matter of fact, the communists then set up another meeting on July 4th and 5th of 1930, the founding convention of the Unemployed Councils of America in Chicago. There were 1,300 people in attendance, primarily communists. And they decided that they'd have a structure of precinct action committees, approximately 25 people, city unemployed councils, county unemployed councils, and state councils, an entire worker structure. And the action committees were political. They were focused on national unemployment insurance of $35 per week, which was their first demand. Now, in 1931, the communists and their unemployment councils set up national hunger marches, where people marched across the country all the way to Washington, D.C. with demands from various cities. And the setup they had was of 13 different demands, including things like emergency winter relief in the form of lump sum payments of $150 per worker and $50 per dependent, 7-hour workdays to generate more jobs for other people, a union wage pay scale for unemployed workers so that workers who were unemployed got paid the same amount in every city instead of getting $1 in one city and $3 in another and nobody having enough money. And then, of course, payment of the soldiers' bonuses to veterans of World War I, an end to discrimination against Black Americans and foreign-born workers. This was a very progressive document. Now, the communists had one big strength, and that was they empowered people. They empowered the unemployed by telling them the system is broken. You are not a failure. You're not unable to work. The system is broken. It's not making jobs. And the other thing to remember that's very important for us as we look at the coronavirus and our current situation is that it only took a small core of communists and other people followed them. Matter of fact, in the entire country, the Communist Party was only about 10,000 people. And when the communists, through their workers' councils that they were heavily involved with, took action, other workers followed. Now, the unemployment councils had some very significant victories in the United States. In 1930, after a protest, organizers disrupted a city hall meeting with the mayor, calling him a corrupt mayor and some other stuff that wasn't very nice. And the mayor promptly called them Reds and had the police escort them out. They were literally tossed down the stairs, beaten, and one was hospitalized. But coincidentally, the next day, $1 million in unemployment relief was released by the Board of Estimates. It goes to show that some of these protests were having an effect, and that was direct relief for unemployed workers. Now, at the local level, these unemployed councils stopped evictions. I read an estimate there were 77,000 evictions stopped by unemployment councils. Literally, when somebody was evicted, the word would go out and people would gather and move the family's furniture back into the apartment. You couldn't evict people who were out of work in New York. There were also rent strikes, and these groups also helped people apply for government benefits when they were available. Another thing to remember about the unemployment councils is they spoke for Black people, which is very unusual in those days. In those days, even unions didn't speak for Black people. And when there were boycotts and protests of companies and stores that wouldn't hire Black people, the communists and the unemployed councils supported those boycotts. Noam Chomsky, the great liberal thinker, contends that during the Great Depression, the Communist Party was the spearhead for labor and civil rights organizing. The communists had a big effect. And the unemployed councils, where they disappeared 2 years later, was they merged with other socialist workers' organizations to form the Workers' Alliance in 1936. Now, the important thing to remember is that the pressure of these protests changed the politics of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran a New Deal for working Americans. Many of the ideas of the Unemployed Workers Council led directly to the New Deal, including Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act to protect unions, the Work Progress Administration to find jobs for people, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and of course, unemployment insurance, the major demand of these worker councils, was included in the Social Security Act. These worker councils had an impact on this country that affect us down to this day. So what if we had employment councils today? Well, they could take on two different areas of opportunity. The first is political and being the voice for the unemployed. They could identify issues, find today's equivalent of the 13 demands of unemployed workers. They could do advocacy, which is lobbying for change, and there's going to be tremendous opportunity to do that as I consider the thousands of people who may be unemployed for months, even years out of this coronavirus stuff. Protests, hold events, bring others along. At some point, we'll find ways to hold protests again. And of course, I hope the unemployed councils connect with the labor movement and other supporters and other groups. These things work together better when we work together. Now, I was reading in People's World when I was looking for examples of unemployed councils that somebody had one in the 80s in Steel Country in Pennsylvania, I believe it was. And they did things like have a food pantry. They held food drives, distributed food. They had assistance with the government programs and completing forms and support. They basically set up a crisis center for people who are unemployed. And after you went and filed your unemployment paperwork, you went over to the crisis center to receive other support. One of the support things they did that was very interesting to me was they used their labor to help others. They cleaned some churches, and they did some other community work, which, by the way, gave purpose to the people who were unemployed for a long time. I found a couple other interesting ideas that under the human services kind of thing that unemployed councils could do for other unemployed workers and their families. And I read about cooperating to barter to help with auto home repair, different things like that, but essentially bartering services. And then, of course, connecting with other community groups like churches to support unemployed workers. Now, what's really interesting is that there's no models. There's nobody putting out a requirement of a national workers' council model like the communists had. And there's very few examples of unemployed councils or anything similar. What I see this as is this creates an open field of opportunity. If unemployed workers wanted to band together, call themselves a council, and then go out and serve others or advocate for themselves, there's an open field of opportunity, and there's also tremendous need. I don't think we really understand how many years and how many people are going to be unemployed for how many years. It's time for people to step up and take care of themselves, do what Americans have done for hundreds of years, ever since de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, form groups, go out and do what needs to be done.